Good afternoon. Today I shall be giving you a very brief preview of the background to Christopher Marlowe's play, The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus. The first part of our talk would be based on the Faustus legend and its origin. In the early Christian era, a number of stories developed concerning men who were supposed to have acquired supernatural gifts or powers by making agreements with the devil. One of the earliest and most widespread of these legends told of a bishop senescal named Theophilus who, in the reign of Emperor Justinian, was wrongfully dismissed from his office. In his resentment, he sealed a contract renouncing Jesus Christ and the Virgin Mary and acknowledging Satan as his Lord. His restoration to his office followed immediately, but Theophilus soon became terrified at what he had done. For 40 nights he fasted and prayed to the Virgin. At last she appeared and listened to his plea. Reassured of the divine mercy, he made a public confession of his sin and proclaimed the miracle of his preservation. The contract that he had was burnt, and Theophilus shortly afterwards died in a state of grace, becoming known as Theophilus the Penitent. His story is representative of many, for interest in this theme persisted throughout the Middle Ages. In the 16th century, a new leading character emerged who was to become perhaps more famous than Theophilus or any other of his predecessors. The age was that of the wandering scholars, the disseminators of new learning, men who were masters and practitioners of many arts and who were often popularly suspected of magic and sorcery. Belief in magic and witchcraft seems to have infected the very air of the 16th and 17th centuries. Conditions were such that one of these strolling scholars, a German, became the nucleus around which there crystallized a whole body of legend and folklore related to the notion of a compact or a contract with the evil one. The historical George or John Faustus seems to have been an itinerant scholar and fortune teller. Documents alluding to his activities bear dates from 1507 to the later 1530s. Another document dated 1545 mentions that he had died not long before. These documents do not compose a very attractive portrait. One of them tells us that as a schoolmaster, Faustus had been guilty of the grossest immorality and that he had taken flight from punishment. Two of them refer to his arrogance and boastfulness. A work published by a Protestant theologian in 1548 was in fact the first work to ascribe to Dr. Faustus a definitive association with the supernatural powers of evil and a death at the hands of the devil. A fuller description of this terrible death followed in 1562. During the subsequent 25 years or so, a quarter of a century, the legend underwent further elaboration. In 1572, around that time, a translation of a work which had been published 2 years earlier on the continent made Faustus's name known to the English readers. Then, in 1587, there appeared the first full and consecutive narrative of the legendary life and death of this new leading character in the old tale of the compact with Satan. This, the work perhaps of an anonymous Protestant, was published in Frankfurt as Historia von de Johann Faustin and may be conveniently referred to as the German Faust book. A translation of its title page will give a very fair idea of its scope and tendency. And the English translation of the title page reads, History of Dr. John Faust, the celebrated conjurer and master of black magic. How he sold himself to the devil, with effect from an appointed time. What in the meanwhile were the strange adventures he witnessed, himself initiated and conducted, until at last he received his well-deserved reward, mostly collected and printed from his own writings, which he left behind him as a terrifying instance and horrible example, and as a friendly warning to all arrogant, insolent-minded and godless men. Unquote. So a rather long title. The motto apparently is taken from James the Fourth, verse 7, which reads, Submit yourself therefore to God, resist the devil and he will flee from you. The first book aims above all at an edification. It shows the awful consequences of a sinner's deliberate commitment of himself to evil with a view to gratifying his pride, ambition, and perhaps lust. At the same time, the historical Faustus had been a wandering scholar, and even his moralist biographer was affected by the characteristic influences of his time. So the German Faust book allows its hero some slight touches of the Renaissance intellectual curiosity. The century was also that of the Reformation, so it was easy enough for the legend to acquire a severe anti-papal bias. The age in which Marlowe conceived his play was the age which saw the full flowering of the Renaissance in England. This complex, many-sided movement, termed the Renaissance, had begun in Italy perhaps 200 years earlier. It had grown in strength and had spread, and early in the 16th century, it reached even the remote British Isles. Wherever its influence penetrated, we have evidence that great things were achieved in the arts, and especially in the arts of painting, sculpture, architecture, and poetry. In English literature, its immediate representatives include Edmund Spenser, Francis Bacon, William Shakespeare, John Donne, Ben Jonson, and John Milton. They include Marlowe as well. A number of distinguishable trends contributed to this many-sided but yet united movement as a whole. First, there was the new learning. The humanists were reviving and extending classical studies, and so making available to their fellows a wider range of knowledge and ideas. And printing, invented in the 15th century, helped greatly in the dissemination of the fresh materials. Under the influence of this new learning, there evolved the ideal of the cultivated Renaissance man, in whom all the faculties were harmoniously present and actively exercised. This was an ideal which most Englishmen who were educated aspired to. For example, Philip Sidney. Secondly, there was what we know as the Reformation, which challenged the view that only as a member of the corporate body, the church, could ensure individual salvation. The Protestants, in separating themselves from the Roman Catholic Church, tended to emphasize the individual's responsibility for finding salvation by reading and interpreting scripture for himself. In England, the Anglican Church was attempting to take the middle way between Roman Catholic institutionalism and Protestant individualism. Third, there was the discovery of new lands and new routes, that is, new sea routes. Columbus discovered America. Vasco da Gama doubled the Cape of Good Hope and sailed to India. Ferdinand Magellan penetrated a vast stretch of the sea into the Pacific Ocean and was the first to circumnavigate the earth, along with another famous Englishman, Sir Francis Drake. Such voyages, unthought of earlier, had important economic and other practical consequences. In addition, they gave men the sense that in the physical world, as in the world of the ideas, the boundaries of the known were being very rapidly enlarged. Finally, exploration was proceeding beyond the earth itself. In place of the old view that the entire universe centered on a stationary earth, there was being elaborated the new view that the earth was only one among many planets traveling round the sun. Copernicus put forward this view in 1543, and Galileo, born in the same year as Marlowe and Shakespeare, brought the theory to the practical test through his telescope. It must not be thought that those discoveries had much effect even upon educated Elizabethans. Marlowe, for example, still thought of the universe in the old Ptolemaic way, as centered on a stationary earth. Nevertheless, the new science was developing, and Francis Bacon was one of its earliest philosophers. As a whole, the general movement we call the Renaissance can be seen in a number of different ways. It can be seen as a revolt, as it were, against the stable and ordered but restrictive world of the later Middle Ages. More positively, it can be seen as what Walter Pater, two of whose formulations on the subject are famous, happened to call it a general excitement and enlightenment of the human mind. This excitement found expression in a free-ranging curiosity which tended to enlighten men both about themselves, their role and potential on earth, the nature of their abilities and activities, and even about the way they thought of the world and the universe around them. It found expression also in the new individualism in human conduct, philosophy, religion, and art, which is so prominent a feature of the age. Perhaps these three, namely an impulse towards emancipation, a spirit of inquiry, and an assertion of individualism, are the leading characteristics of the Renaissance movement and as we understand it. In Dr. Faustus, Marlowe placed a representative of it upon the English stage. In the first book, Dr. Faustus calls himself, quote unquote, an insatiable speculator, and that minute traces of the same Renaissance intellectual curiosity are visible even in the hero of German first book. But such slight manifestations might easily have passed unnoticed if Marlowe's achievement had not altered us to look for something of the kind in his predecessors. In the main book, the author of the German first book and his English translator both aimed at edifying their readers. Like other homilists, they are not above exploiting the sensational and the farcical possibilities of the tale they tell, but they have little sympathy with the aspirations which lead Faustus to conclude his compact, and they use his decline and fall simply to point a serious moral warning to their readers. Christopher Marlowe, however, takes a much more complex attitude towards the material that he has inherited in terms of the first book. His Faustus, we see, has restless curiosity, a riotous imagination, and the audacious desires of a man responding fully and delightedly to the new trends in his age and the possibilities they seem to open up. Marlowe apparently and evidently feels a fervent sympathy with this character Faustus, but his sympathy is far from unqualified. He makes it clear in the play itself that Dr. Faustus is arrogant and headstrong, and that catastrophe is one that he, as it were, willfully brings about. The Marlowe who shows us this is no longer the simple rebel who wrote plays, for example, like Tamerlane the Great. Admittedly, rebellious impulses remain strong in him, but they are now opposed by the orthodox conviction that a sin of presumption or pride, such as Faustus commits, can ultimately lead only to destruction. Embodying the tension between these forces, Dr. Faustus, despite the unevenness of its execution, is indubitably Marlowe's greatest play, and this Renaissance play embodies the tension the more successfully because it is cast in a largely medieval mode.